The corner office on the executive floor blazed with light at 10:47 p.m. while the entire building sat shrouded in darkness. Jack Miller glided his mop across the cold marble floor, his eyes inadvertently catching the oak desk worth tens of thousands of dollars. Behind the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seattle's skyline, Richard Cole, the 69-year-old tech mogul, gripped the edge of his desk, face ashen, breathing like he'd just run a marathon. In the silence of the late night, a persistent dry cough echoed from the most powerful office in the building. Jack stopped, his heart pounding. These symptoms, he'd seen them before. He doesn't know he's dying, and I'm the only one here. Jack Miller had cleaned these floors for 3 years, moving through TechnoVision Industries like a ghost nobody bothered to notice. At 43, his shoulders carried the weight of a man who'd learned that life rarely asked permission before taking what mattered most. The late shift suited him perfectly. Fewer people meant fewer questions. The executive floor was his final stop each night, a pristine world of glass and steel. Jack had memorized every inch, from abstract paintings worth more than his annual salary to imported leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars. Richard Cole's office dominated the northwest corner, its massive windows offering a commanding view of Elliott Bay. Jack had observed the man for months, noting his habits with quiet attention. Richard arrived before 6 every morning and rarely left before midnight. He seemed to view sleep as a necessary inconvenience. Tonight felt different. Jack paused outside the partially open door, hearing something that made his pulse quicken. That dry, persistent cough wasn't new. He'd noticed it growing more frequent over recent weeks. But now it was accompanied by something else. A change in breathing pattern that triggered memories Jack had spent years trying to bury. Through the gap in the door, he could see Richard standing behind his desk, one hand pressed against his chest while the other gripped the mahogany surface. The man's face had taken on a grayish pallor, and perspiration dotted his forehead despite the building's climate control. He'd seen these exact symptoms before, 15 years ago, in a cramped hospital room. His father had displayed the same subtle signs in the weeks leading up to that final heart attack. The way he'd pause to catch his breath, the unconscious gesture of pressing his palm against his chest, the gradual change in color that others dismissed as fatigue. Jack forced himself to continue mopping while his mind raced. The distance between their worlds felt insurmountable. He was the help, invisible by design. Richard Cole commanded boardrooms and influenced markets. What business did a janitor have diagnosing the health of a tech titan? But as Jack watched Richard sink slowly into his chair, taking measured breaths, every instinct screamed that time was running out. The question wasn't whether he had the right to intervene. It was whether he could live with himself if he didn't. The rain had started around 9 o'clock, turning Seattle's streets into rivers of reflected neon. By the time Jack reached the executive floor, the storm was drumming against the windows, creating an oddly intimate atmosphere in the normally sterile corporate environment. Jack's routine had become almost meditative over the years, but tonight felt weighted with anticipation. As he approached Richard's office, he noticed it was brighter than usual. Richard typically worked with just his desk lamp after 10. Tonight, every fixture blazed as if fighting against darkness. The coughing started again, dry and insistent, followed by papers rustling. Then silence. Jack paused, listening for normalcy, keyboard clicks, phone calls. Instead, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of someone struggling to breathe. Without conscious thought, Jack abandoned his cart and moved closer. Through the narrow opening, he could see Richard slumped forward, both hands pressed against his chest, his face contorted with pain and confusion. The powerful CEO looked suddenly fragile, mortal in a way that shattered every assumption about invincibility that wealth could provide. This was the moment that would define everything. The split second when Jack Miller had to choose between the safety of invisibility and the terrifying vulnerability of action. The heavy glass door to Richard's office felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as Jack pushed it open. The soft whoosh of the pneumatic mechanism seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. But Richard didn't look up. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, each inhalation a visible struggle that painted his lips with an alarming blue tinge. "Mr. Cole?" Jack's voice sounded strange in the cavernous office, rough from disuse and thick with concern he couldn't hide. "Sir, are you all right?" Richard's head lifted slowly, his eyes struggling to focus. When recognition finally dawned, the janitor, the invisible man with the mop cart, confusion flickered across his features. His mouth moved as if to speak, to assert authority or demand explanations, but only a weak gasp emerged. Jack had spent enough time in hospital waiting rooms to recognize a cardiac event in progress. The textbook symptoms his father's doctors had described with clinical detachment were playing out in real time. Chest pain, shortness of breath, that telltale pallor that suggested the heart was failing to pump efficiently. Every second that ticked by decreased the chances of a positive outcome. Without waiting for permission or explanation, Jack pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice was steady as he provided the address and described the situation, years of crisis management compressed into a few urgent sentences. The dispatcher's questions were thorough, but felt endless. Yes, the patient was conscious. No, he wasn't choking. Yes, this appeared to be cardiac in nature. "Sir, I need you to stay with me," Jack said, kneeling beside Richard's chair. "Help is coming. Can you tell me where it hurts?" Richard's hand trembled as he pointed to his chest, his eyes wide with a fear that probably hadn't touched him in decades. The man who controlled billion-dollar budgets and made decisions that affected thousands of employees was reduced to the most basic human vulnerability. The terrible recognition that money and power offered no protection against the failure of flesh and blood. Jack loosened Richard's tie and unbuttoned the top of his shirt, actions learned during a workplace safety course he'd taken years ago when he still believed his life would follow a different trajectory. The silk fabric felt impossibly expensive between his work-roughened fingers, a tactile reminder of the vast divide between their worlds that circumstances had suddenly rendered meaningless. The minutes stretched like hours as they waited for the paramedics, marked only by Richard's labored breathing and the steady drum of rain against glass. Jack found himself talking, filling the silence with gentle reassurances and practical instructions. "Breathe slowly. Try to relax. Focus on my voice." It felt surreal, this reversal of roles, the invisible man becoming the anchor of stability for someone whose very existence represented everything he'd never been able to achieve. When the emergency responders finally arrived, their efficient professionalism transformed the executive office into a medical theater. Portable monitors, oxygen tanks, and other equipment filled the space where million-dollar deals were normally negotiated. Jack stepped back, resuming his proper place in the shadows, but Richard's eyes tracked his movement with an intensity that suggested this wouldn't be their last interaction. As the paramedics wheeled Richard toward the elevator, one of them paused beside Jack. "Good call," the young man said simply. "Another 10 or 15 minutes, and we'd probably be dealing with a very different situation." The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, leaving Jack alone in the office that still hummed with the energy of crisis and intervention. Rain continued to streak the windows, and the city lights below sparkled like scattered diamonds, indifferent to the human drama that had just unfolded 47 floors above the streets. Jack stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the trappings of success and power, wondering if he'd just saved a life or simply postponed an inevitable conclusion. Either way, the careful distance he'd maintained between his world and Richard's had been permanently shattered. Tomorrow would bring questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer, consequences he couldn't predict, and a connection he'd never sought but could no longer deny. The days that followed Richard's heart attack moved with the strange, suspended quality of time after a crisis. Jack returned to his regular routine, mopping floors, emptying trash cans, maintaining the invisible infrastructure that kept corporate America running smoothly. But the executive floor felt different now, charged with the memory of emergency lights and urgent voices, of a powerful man reduced to his most vulnerable human essence. News of Richard's condition traveled through the building with the speed that only gossip could achieve. The official statements spoke of exhaustion and minor health issues, carefully crafted language designed to maintain investor confidence and corporate stability. But the cleaning staff heard different stories from the nurses who worked the cardiac unit at Seattle General, whispered conversations about blocked arteries and emergency procedures that painted a far more serious picture. Jack found himself avoiding the executive floor entirely for the first few days, trading shifts with other custodial workers and focusing on the lower levels where life continued its predictable rhythm. But the building's head of security, a retired police officer named Martinez, who'd always treated the cleaning crew with more respect than most, sought him out on Thursday evening. "Company's asking questions about Monday night," Martinez said, his tone carefully neutral. "They want to talk to whoever found Mr. Cole." The interview took place in a sterile conference room on the 32nd floor, far enough below the executive level to feel safe, but high enough to maintain corporate gravity. 3 people sat across from Jack, a woman from Human Resources whose smile never quite reached her eyes, a company lawyer whose presence suggested this was more serious than anyone wanted to admit, and a man from the board of directors whose name Jack recognized from the business pages. They asked careful questions about his duties, his access to the executive floor, his interaction with Richard that night. Jack answered honestly but minimally, describing his discovery of Richard in distress and his decision to call for help. He didn't mention the weeks of observation that had preceded that moment, the gradual accumulation of symptoms that had triggered his recognition of a medical emergency. The lawyer took extensive notes, his pen scratching across legal pads with mechanical precision. The HR representative nodded encouragingly at appropriate moments, maintaining the fiction that this was a friendly debriefing rather than a potential liability assessment. The board member said little, but watched Jack with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to measuring risk and opportunity. "You showed remarkable presence of mind," the board member finally said. "Quick thinking in a crisis situation. The company appreciates your initiative." There was something in his tone that suggested appreciation might come with complications. Jack had worked in corporate America long enough to recognize the double-edged nature of standing out, the way visibility could transform from asset to liability, depending on circumstances beyond his control. When the interview concluded, Jack returned to his duties with the uncomfortable feeling that his anonymous existence was coming to an end. The other cleaning staff treated him differently now, some with newfound respect, others with the wariness that came from seeing a peer step outside established boundaries. He'd become a story, a cautionary tale or inspiration depending on perspective, and stories had a way of taking on lives of their own. That evening, as Jack prepared to leave the building, Martinez approached him again. This time, his expression was harder to read, professional courtesy mixed with something that might have been concern. "Got a message for you," he said, extending a sealed envelope bearing the company letterhead. "From upstairs." Jack took the envelope, but didn't open it until he reached his car in the parking garage. The letter was brief, written on heavy paper that whispered wealth and authority. Richard Cole requested his presence at Seattle General Hospital the following day, visiting hours between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. The signature was shaky but unmistakable, a personal touch that transformed the request from corporate obligation into something more complex and uncertain. The drive home took Jack through neighborhoods that told the story of Seattle's evolution from industrial port to tech hub. Modest houses stood next to modern condominiums, craftsman bungalows sharing blocks with architectural experiments that cost more than most people's lifetime earnings. It was a city where success and struggle coexisted in uncomfortable proximity, where the distance between janitor and CEO could be measured in miles but felt like different universes entirely. Jack's apartment occupied the second floor of a converted house in a neighborhood that gentrification hadn't quite reached. The building was solid but showing its age, the kind of place where working people could still afford to live while saving for something better. His unit was small but clean, furnished with items chosen for durability rather than style, a functional space that reflected the practical necessities of single parenthood. 11-year-old Ethan was sprawled across the living room floor when Jack arrived, surrounded by homework and the detritus of after-school snacking. The boy looked up with the quick smile that never failed to lighten Jack's mood, despite the weight of the day's complications. "How was work, Dad?" Ethan asked, the question part routine and part genuine curiosity. At 11, he was old enough to understand that adult life involved challenges, but young enough to believe his father could handle anything that came their way. Jack settled into his usual chair, a well-worn recliner that had been a luxury purchase during better times. "Interesting," he said, which was true if incomplete. "How was school?" Ethan launched into a detailed description of his day, a math test he thought he'd aced, drama in the cafeteria involving traded lunches and hurt feelings, plans for a science project that required materials they'd need to budget for carefully. Normal life, the kind of everyday complexity that made Jack's encounter with crisis and corporate power feel like something from someone else's story. Later that evening, after Ethan had finished his homework and been tucked into bed with his current book and the nightlight he was almost too old for but not quite ready to abandon, Jack sat alone with Richard's letter. The paper felt substantial between his fingers, expensive in a way that reminded him of the vast gulf between their circumstances. He thought about the man he'd found struggling for breath, reduced to the most basic human vulnerability despite all his wealth and influence. In that moment, Richard Cole had been simply another person in need of help, stripped of the protective barriers that money and status could provide. But now, in the aftermath, those barriers were reasserting themselves, and Jack wasn't sure what role he was expected to play in whatever came next. Jack had taken a half-day off work to make the visit, a decision that cost him 4 hours of pay he couldn't easily afford. But Richard's request had carried a weight that made refusal feel impossible. The private room occupied a corner of the cardiac floor. Richard sat in a chair beside his bed, dressed in hospital scrubs that made him look smaller and more ordinary than Jack had ever seen him. "Mr. Miller." Richard's voice was stronger than Jack had expected, though still carrying traces of the exhaustion that comes after a major medical event. "Thank you for coming." Jack took the offered chair, immediately conscious of his work clothes and the careful distance he usually maintained from this level of corporate hierarchy. The room felt intimate in a way that made normal social boundaries seem arbitrary. Two men brought together by circumstances neither had chosen, but both had to navigate. "How are you feeling, sir?" The question seemed inadequate given the magnitude of what had happened, but social conventions provided few alternatives for addressing near-death experiences with people who existed in different worlds. Richard's laugh held no humor. "Like a man who's been reminded of his mortality in the most direct way possible. The doctors tell me I'm lucky. If you hadn't called when you did, we'd probably be having a very different conversation, if we were having one at all." The acknowledgement hung between them, more significant than mere gratitude. Jack had saved Richard's life, an act that created a debt neither man fully understood how to address. In their normal circumstances, such intimacy would have been impossible, prevented by the careful hierarchies that kept corporate America functioning smoothly. "I just did what anyone would have done," Jack said, the automatic response of someone uncomfortable with praise or attention. "No." Richard's voice carried the authority that had built his empire, softened now by genuine emotion. Most people would have called someone else, passed the responsibility up the chain. You acted directly, immediately. You took charge when it mattered. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the afternoon light paint patterns on the hospital floor. Through the windows, Seattle continued its relentless rhythm of construction and commerce, indifferent to the small human drama playing out in a cardiac unit high above the streets. "I need to ask you something," Richard said finally. "How did you know? How did you recognize what was happening?" The question Jack had been dreading since Monday night, the one that would require him to reveal pieces of his life he'd kept carefully hidden behind professional anonymity. But sitting in this hospital room, surrounded by the machinery that had helped save Richard's life, maintaining distance felt both impossible and unnecessary. "My father died of a heart attack when I was 28, Jack said simply. "I'd been watching you for weeks, seeing the same symptoms. The way you'd pause walking down the hall, how you'd touch your chest without thinking about it. The coughing that was getting worse. It was like watching a movie I'd seen before, except this time I could do something about the ending." Richard absorbed this information with the focused attention he typically reserved for quarterly reports and strategic planning. "I'm sorry about your father, and I'm grateful that his experience helped you save my life. That's not a connection most people would have been able to make." The conversation that followed revealed details neither man had expected to share. Richard spoke about the isolation that came with ultimate responsibility, the way success could become a prison that separated him from genuine human connection. Jack found himself talking about single parenthood, about the choices and sacrifices that had led him from skilled trades to custodial work, about the pride and struggle of raising a child alone. As visiting hours drew to a close, Richard extended an invitation that surprised them both. "I'd like to meet your son," he said. "When I'm out of here, perhaps you'd both join me for dinner. Nothing formal, just a chance to thank the family of the man who saved my life." Jack left the hospital with more questions than answers, carrying the strange weight of a relationship that defied easy categorization. The distance between their worlds hadn't disappeared, but it had been bridged in ways that would prove impossible to ignore. Whatever came next would require both men to navigate territory neither had ever explored, where corporate hierarchies meant less than human obligations and the simple act of caring about another person's welfare. The weeks following Richard's hospitalization developed a rhythm that felt both natural and impossible. Jack returned to his regular duties, but the executive floor now carried personal significance that transformed routine maintenance into something more complex. He found himself noting details he'd previously overlooked, the way afternoon light filled the conference rooms, the carefully curated artwork that reflected Richard's aesthetic preferences, the subtle signs of a workspace designed by someone who spent most of his waking hours within its boundaries. Richard's recovery progressed according to medical expectations, but his approach to work underwent changes that rippled through the company in ways both obvious and subtle. The man who had routinely worked 16-hour days now left the office by 8 most evenings. Meetings that had previously extended indefinitely were given firm end times. The legendary intensity that had built TechnoVision Industries was being tempered by a newfound awareness of personal limitations. The dinner invitation materialized 2 weeks after Richard's return to work. The restaurant Richard chose was elegant, but not ostentatious. Jack had never been somewhere that required reservations made weeks in advance. Ethan had approached the evening with excitement and nervousness. Jack had explained the situation simply, a man from his work who wanted to say thank you. Richard arrived precisely on time, a habit that seemed ingrained regardless of context. He looked healthier than he had in the hospital, though Jack noticed the careful way he moved, the unconscious hand that occasionally touched his chest as if reassuring himself that everything was functioning properly. The transformation from powerful CEO to cardiac patient and back again had left subtle marks that only someone trained in observation would detect. "You must be Ethan," Richard said, offering a handshake that acknowledged the boy as an individual worthy of respect. "Your father told me you're interested in technology." What followed was a conversation that revealed unexpected depths in both participants. Ethan displayed the kind of intellectual curiosity that reminded Jack of his own younger self, asking questions about computer programming and digital innovation with genuine fascination. Richard responded with the patience of someone who remembered what it felt like to discover the possibilities that technology could offer, explaining complex concepts in terms an 11-year-old could grasp. As the evening progressed, Jack found himself observing a side of Richard that corporate America never saw. The man who commanded boardrooms and influenced markets possessed an almost grandfatherly gentleness when dealing with Ethan's endless questions. The legendary perfectionism that had built his empire was tempered by warmth and genuine interest in nurturing a young mind. "Do you think I could work for a company like yours someday?" Ethan asked during dessert, the question delivered with the serious intensity that characterized most 11-year-old inquiries about the future. Richard considered the question with the same attention he might give to a strategic planning session. "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," he said. "But the most important thing isn't working for someone else's company. It's understanding what you want to contribute to the world and finding the best way to make that happen." The conversation that followed touched on education, opportunity, and the importance of developing both technical skills and human understanding. Jack listened with growing appreciation for Richard's approach to mentorship, the way he managed to inspire without overwhelming, to encourage without making promises he couldn't keep. When the evening concluded, Richard extended an invitation that surprised everyone involved. "I'd like to show Ethan our development lab sometime," he said. "We're working on some projects that might interest a young person with his curiosity." The drive home was filled with Ethan's excited chatter about computers and programming and the possibility of seeing where real technology was created. Jack listened with mixed emotions: pride in his son's intelligence and enthusiasm, gratitude for Richard's unexpected kindness, and a growing unease about the implications of their developing relationship. That night, after Ethan had finally exhausted his excitement and fallen asleep, Jack sat alone in his living room, wondering what he'd gotten them into. The dinner had been pleasant, even revelatory, but it had also highlighted the vast differences between their circumstances in ways that felt both inspiring and daunting. Richard's casual offer to show Ethan the development lab represented opportunities that Jack could never provide on his own, chances for his son to see possibilities that extended far beyond their current circumstances. But it also represented a level of involvement in their lives that went far beyond simple gratitude for a life-saving intervention. Jack had spent years building a stable, if modest, existence for himself and his son. The intrusion of Richard's world, with its unlimited resources and complex social dynamics, threatened that stability in ways he wasn't sure he was prepared to handle. The relationship that had begun with a medical emergency was evolving into something more complex and potentially more dangerous. Jack found himself walking a tightrope between appreciation and wariness, grateful for Richard's interest in Ethan while concerned about the long-term implications of such attention from someone whose world operated by rules he didn't fully understand. The visit to TechnoVision's development lab took place on a Saturday afternoon, when the building was largely empty except for security staff and the occasional engineer pursuing personal projects. Richard met them at the main entrance, casual clothes making him appear more approachable than the intimidating figure Jack knew from corporate communications and quarterly reports. The lab occupied an entire floor near the building's midpoint, a maze of workstations and testing equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Engineers had transformed the space into a playground for technological innovation, where theoretical concepts became practical applications and childhood dreams about the future took tangible form. Ethan's excitement was infectious as Richard guided them through demonstrations of augmented reality systems, artificial intelligence applications, and robotics platforms that seemed to respond to thought as much as programming. The boy asked questions that revealed an intuitive understanding of technological principles, connections that impressed even the veteran engineers who stopped their weekend projects to participate in impromptu explanations. "He's got natural instincts for this," Richard told Jack as they watched Ethan successfully modify a simple program under the guidance of a young developer. "The kind of thinking that can't really be taught. You either see the patterns or you don't." Jack felt the familiar mixture of pride and concern that came from watching his son excel in areas he couldn't fully support. Ethan's gifts were becoming apparent just as he reached the age where educational choices would determine future opportunities. The public school system was adequate, but not exceptional, and private alternatives remained financially impossible despite Jack's careful budgeting and planning. As if reading his thoughts, Richard broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind since their dinner the previous week. "I'd like to discuss Ethan's education," he said during a quiet moment, while the boy was absorbed in testing a virtual reality system. "There are opportunities available. Scholarships, advanced programs, summer camps focused on technology development. Ways to nurture his interests without creating financial hardship for your family." The offer was generous and carefully framed to preserve dignity while acknowledging reality. Jack understood the subtext. Richard had recognized Ethan's potential and wanted to ensure it wasn't wasted due to economic limitations. The intervention was exactly what any parent would want for their child, and exactly what Jack feared most about their developing relationship. "That's very generous," Jack said carefully. "But I'm not sure it would be appropriate. Ethan is my responsibility, and I've always managed to provide what he needs." Richard's response revealed the diplomatic skills that had made him successful in business negotiations. "Of course, he's your responsibility, and it's clear you're doing an excellent job raising him, but sometimes opportunities arise that benefit everyone involved. I'm not trying to replace your role as his father. I'm offering to supplement it in areas where I happen to have resources and connections." The conversation that followed was delicate, both men navigating territory where pride, practicality, and genuine care for Ethan's welfare intersected in complex ways. Richard made it clear that his interest in helping was personal rather than charitable, driven by recognition of potential rather than pity for circumstances. Jack struggled with the independence he'd cultivated during years of single parenthood, the careful self-reliance that had enabled him to build a stable life despite significant challenges. The resolution they reached was tentative, but workable. Richard would provide information about opportunities and programs, while Jack retained final decision-making authority about Ethan's participation. It was a compromise that acknowledged both Richard's desire to help and Jack's need to remain the primary influence in his son's life. As they prepared to leave the lab, Ethan approached with the kind of serious expression that indicated an important question was coming. "Mr. Cole," he said, "why are you being so nice to us? I mean, I'm glad you are, but my dad always tells me that adults usually have reasons for things they do." Richard knelt to Ethan's eye level, considering the question with the respect it deserved. "Your father saved my life," he said simply. "When someone does something that important for you, it changes how you think about a lot of things. Helping your family isn't just about saying thank you. It's about recognizing that some debts can't be repaid directly." The answer satisfied Ethan's curiosity, while leaving Jack with new questions about the nature of obligation and gratitude between people from different worlds. As they rode the elevator down to the parking garage, he wondered whether Richard's investment in their lives was motivated by genuine affection or by the successful businessman's need to balance accounts in whatever way possible. The months that followed established a pattern of interaction that felt both natural and surreal. Richard became a regular presence in their lives, though always in ways that respected the boundaries Jack had established. He attended Ethan's school science fair, where the boys' project on renewable energy systems earned first place and attracted attention from high school recruiters. He provided tickets to technology conferences and coding workshops that expanded Ethan's understanding of what was possible in the digital world. More surprisingly, Richard began seeking Jack's perspective on matters that seemed far removed from custodial work. He asked questions about employee morale, about the practical challenges of working multiple jobs, about the gap between corporate policy and workplace reality. Jack found himself serving as an informal consultant on issues related to the company's treatment of hourly workers, his insights valued for their directness and authenticity. The relationship was transforming both men in ways neither had anticipated. Richard was rediscovering the satisfaction that came from personal connections outside the competitive pressures of corporate leadership. Jack was developing confidence in areas beyond his traditional expertise, recognizing that his life experience provided wisdom that transcended educational credentials or professional status. But the foundation supporting their unusual friendship was about to be tested by revelations that would force both men to confront uncomfortable truths about the past, present, and the complex nature of justice and forgiveness in a world where power and privilege created lasting consequences for decisions made long ago. The letter arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October, delivered by certified mail to Jack's apartment, with the kind of official gravity that immediately suggested significant legal implications. The return address showed the offices of Morrison, Bradley and Associates, a law firm whose television advertisements promised aggressive representation for personal injury cases throughout the Pacific Northwest. Jack opened the envelope with the careful attention he reserved for documents that might affect his family's financial stability. What he found was a notification that a class action lawsuit had been filed against TechnoVision Industries, specifically targeting the company's alleged negligence in maintaining its vehicle fleet during the period from 2008 to 2012. The letter invited him to join the litigation as a named plaintiff, citing his wife's death in a vehicle accident involving a company-owned truck as grounds for significant financial compensation. The memories that letter triggered were ones Jack had spent years trying to manage. Sarah's death had been ruled accidental, a tragic collision between her compact car and a TechnoVision delivery truck whose driver had fallen asleep at the wheel during a double shift that violated federal regulations. The company had settled quickly and quietly, providing enough money to cover funeral expenses and basic support for Jack and 3-year-old Ethan while avoiding any admission of wrongdoing. Jack had accepted that settlement because fighting seemed impossible from his position as a grieving widower with a young child and limited resources. The company's lawyers had painted the accident as unavoidable tragedy, while their insurance representatives had emphasized the generous nature of their offer compared to what a lengthy court battle might produce. Exhausted by grief and overwhelmed by sudden single parenthood, Jack had signed the papers and tried to move forward. Now, sitting in his living room with legal documents spread across the coffee table, Jack was learning that the accident might not have been as random as he'd been led to believe. The law firm's research had uncovered a pattern of maintenance violations and safety shortcuts that had been systematically covered up by TechnoVision's management during the period when Richard Cole was consolidating power and building the empire that made him one of Seattle's most respected business leaders. The truck that killed Sarah had been operating with faulty brakes that should have been repaired weeks earlier. The driver had been working excessive hours that violated both company policy and federal transportation regulations. The accident scene had been sanitized by private investigators before law enforcement could conduct a thorough examination, and potentially damaging evidence had disappeared before trial attorneys could review it. Jack read through the documentation with growing horror and confusion. The man he'd saved, the mentor who was helping guide his son toward a better future, the friend who had shown genuine care for their welfare, was potentially responsible for the circumstances that had destroyed his first life and forced him into the struggle that had defined his existence for the past decade. The questions that letter raised were impossible to answer without confronting Richard directly, but that conversation would require Jack to acknowledge that he'd known about the potential connection all along, because the truth was, he had recognized Richard's name when he first took the job at TechnoVision. The company that had killed his wife was the same one where he now pushed a mop cart through executive corridors, a decision he'd made for reasons he'd never fully explained to himself. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Jack called the law firm's evening number and spoke with a paralegal who explained the basics of the litigation. The case was strong, with documentary evidence suggesting a corporate culture that prioritized profits over safety in ways that had led to multiple preventable accidents. The potential settlement could provide financial security for families like Jack's, compensation for losses that could never truly be repaid, but might at least acknowledge the human cost of corporate negligence. But pursuing the lawsuit would mean betraying the trust of a man who had shown genuine kindness to his family, destroying a relationship that had brought opportunities and hope into their lives. It would mean admitting to Richard that their entire friendship was built on a foundation of deception, that Jack had known from the beginning about the potential connection between Richard's company and Sarah's death. The moral complexity of the situation consumed Jack's thoughts over the following days. During his shifts at TechnoVision, he found himself studying Richard through new eyes, looking for signs of the corporate ruthlessness that could have enabled the cover-up described in the legal documents. But what he saw was the same man who had patiently answered Ethan's endless questions about technology, who had shown genuine interest in improving working conditions for hourly employees, who had demonstrated remarkable humility in the face of his own mortality. The breakthrough came during an unexpected encounter the following Friday evening. Jack was finishing his duties on the executive floor when he noticed Richard's office light still burning well past normal business hours. Through the partially open door, he could see the man hunched over his desk, surrounded by file folders and legal documents that looked remarkably similar to the ones Jack had received earlier that week. "Mr. Miller," Richard called out, noticing Jack's presence in the hallway. "Could you spare a moment? I'd like to speak with you about something important." The conversation that followed would forever change both their lives. Richard had received notification of the class action lawsuit and had spent the week conducting his own investigation into the company's practices during the period in question. What he'd discovered had shaken him to his core, a systematic pattern of cost-cutting measures and safety violations that had been implemented by his predecessor and continued during the early years of his own leadership. "I need to tell you something," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of a confession years in the making. "About the accident that killed your wife, about the company's role in what happened, about why I've been trying so hard to help your family." The revelation that followed was more complex than either the lawsuit or Jack's suspicions had suggested. Richard had inherited a company culture that prioritized profits over safety, but he had also inherited specific knowledge about the accident that had claimed Sarah's life. The previous CEO had briefed him on potential liability issues during the transition of leadership, describing the Miller settlement as a clean resolution of a troublesome situation. Richard had been young and ambitious, focused on building his vision for the company's future without fully examining the moral compromises that had enabled his success. But as the years passed and his perspective matured, the weight of those early decisions had grown heavier. The knowledge that his company had killed a young mother and left a family destroyed had become a burden he carried, but never knew how to address. "When I saw you that night, when you saved my life, I didn't immediately remember your name," Richard continued. "But afterward, when I learned who you were, everything came flooding back. The settlement, the cover-up, the way we destroyed evidence and intimidated witnesses to protect the company's reputation. I realized that the man who had saved my life was someone I had unknowingly wronged in the most fundamental way possible." The admission hung between them like a physical presence, years of hidden guilt and unspoken knowledge finally brought into the open. Jack felt a complex mixture of vindication and betrayal, anger at the confirmation of his worst suspicions, combined with appreciation for Richard's willingness to face the truth. "Ah, so all of this," Jack said slowly. "The dinners, the help with Ethan, the job opportunities. It was all guilt money, payment for something you couldn't openly acknowledge." Richard's response revealed the genuine complexity of his motivations. "It started that way," he admitted. "I couldn't figure out how to make direct amends without destroying both our lives and exposing the company to massive liability. But somewhere along the way, it became something more. You and Ethan became important to me in ways that had nothing to do with the past. The guilt brought us together, but what developed afterward was real. The conversation that followed was painful and necessary, two men confronting the intersection of personal responsibility and corporate power, individual guilt, and systemic negligence. Richard revealed the full extent of the company's cover-up, providing Jack with information that would strengthen the lawsuit while simultaneously destroying his own reputation and potentially exposing him to criminal charges. "I want to make this right," Richard said finally. "Not just for you, but for all the families who were affected by our decisions. The lawsuit is an opportunity to force the company to acknowledge what we did and ensure it never happens again. I'll testify if necessary, provide whatever documentation you need, accept whatever consequences come from telling the truth." Jack left that meeting with his understanding of justice and forgiveness forever altered. The man he had both saved and befriended was offering to destroy himself to make amends for sins that were both personal and institutional. The gesture was remarkable in its scope and devastating in its implications, representing a level of moral courage that few people in Richard's position would ever demonstrate. But it also placed Jack in an impossible position, forced to choose between financial security for his family and loyalty to a man who had shown genuine care for their welfare. The lawsuit could provide millions in compensation, enough to secure Ethan's education and ensure their long-term stability. But pursuing it would mean destroying Richard and potentially devastating a company that employed thousands of innocent people. The decision Jack ultimately made reflected values shaped by years of struggle and loss. He contacted the law firm and agreed to join the lawsuit, but with conditions that surprised everyone involved. Rather than seeking maximum financial compensation, Jack proposed using the settlement to establish enhanced benefits for TechnoVision employees and create scholarship programs for children who had lost parents in workplace accidents. Richard's response was relief mixed with gratitude. He had expected anger and accusations. Instead, he found himself working alongside the man he had wronged to create something positive from tragedy. The legal proceedings were complex and emotionally challenging. Richard's willingness to acknowledge the company's guilt helped secure a settlement that exceeded expectations. Richard resigned from TechnoVision's leadership to focus on safety advocacy. Jack found himself financially secure enough to pursue opportunities that had previously been impossible. The settlement provided resources for Ethan's education while creating a legacy that honored Sarah's memory. The relationship between Jack and Richard evolved into something that transcended their original circumstances. They had become partners in a mission that gave meaning to loss while creating hope for the future. 2 years later, Jack watched Ethan thrive in an advanced STEM program, while Richard, now in his early 70s, had found new purpose in advocacy work. The friendship that had grown from crisis and been strengthened by truth demonstrated that redemption was possible even in situations that seemed beyond repair. The story that had begun with a janitor noticing symptoms everyone else ignored had evolved into something larger, a testament to the power of human connection to transcend circumstances. Jack's decision to save Richard's life had set in motion events that ultimately honored his wife's memory while securing his son's future. Standing in his small apartment one evening, watching Ethan work on a programming project that Richard had suggested, Jack reflected on the unexpected turns life could take. The distance between their worlds had proven less important than their shared humanity. The recognition that every life had value regardless of wealth or status. Some stories don't end with grand ceremonies or perfect resolutions. Sometimes they end with quiet moments of understanding, with the knowledge that people can change, that forgiveness is possible, and that even the most unlikely connections can become sources of strength and hope for the future.